Families getting ready for their vacation, husbands meeting up with their wives, and couples excited for a getaway all boarded the steamboat on the hot summer's afternoon. This was a typical day on the Great Lakes in the late 19th century, with tourists giddily chattering on deck and children exploring the boat for the short journey to their summer destination. Without passenger boats, summers like this wouldn't have been possible. Welcome to Fast Facts Friday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for a younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. Passenger boats on the Great Lakes began with steamships, and the first steamboat on the Great Lakes depends upon how you translate the timeline. The Canadian-built Frontenac was launched on September 7, 1816 at Ernestown, Ontario, and the US-built Ontario was launched in the spring of 1817 at Sackett's Harbor, New York, beginning her regular service before Frontenac in April of 1817. Frontenac didn't make her first trip until June 5th of that year, so it was one of these two. As for the Upper Great Lakes, the first steamboat was the passenger boat Walk in the Water, built in 1818 specifically to navigate Lake Erie. It was a huge success, and more boats like her were to follow. Steamboats on the lakes grew in size and number, and additional decks were built on the superstructure to allow higher capacity. This inexpensive method of adding capacity was adapted from river steamboats on the Mississippi, and it worked for the lake-going steamboats too. In 1825, the Erie Canal opened, allowing settlers from New England and New York to reach Michigan by water through Albany and Buffalo. This route opening and the incorporation of Chicago in 1837 increased Great Lakes steamboat traffic from Detroit through the Straits of Mackinac to Chicago. These prior steamboats had all been paddle-wheel steamers, and the propeller was introduced to the Great Lakes by Dyalla in 1842, and this allowed the building of a new class of combination passenger and freight carriers. The first of these package and passenger freighters, Hercules, was built in Buffalo in 1843. Hercules displayed all the features that define the type, a screw-propelled vessel. Passengers were accommodated in staterooms on the upper deck, and package freight below on the large main deck and in the holds. Engines developed as well. Compound engines, in which steam was expanded twice for greater efficiency, were first used on the Great Lakes in 1868. In 1887, triple expansion steam engines were introduced for even greater efficiency, and quadruple expansion steam engines appeared on the lakes in 1894, the ultimate type of reciprocating engine for speed, power, and efficiency. Steamboat lines were established by railroad companies on the Great Lakes to join the railheads in the 1850s. This service carried passengers and goods from railroads in the east across the length of the lakes to railroads for the journey west. Railroads bought and built steamship lines to complement their railroad services. One such railroad-owned steamship line was formed by the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1865 to connect their terminals at Buffalo to those of the Northern Pacific Railroad at Duluth, Minnesota. This new line, owned by the Erie and Western Transportation Company, became known as the Anchor Line. The Northern Pacific started its own Northern Steamship Company, which from the mid-1890s operated the steamers Northland and Northwest on the 7-day round-trip cruises between Buffalo and Duluth. Travelers could disembark at several points and were allowed to finish their voyage later in the season. Surprisingly enough, a significant industry in leisure cruising picked up beginning in the late 19th century, providing large passenger boats for travel to summer resorts and hotels in the North Woods, away from polluted cities. Summer hotels like the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island and Ottawa Beach near Holland, Michigan, as well as cottage resorts like Harbor Beach and Petoskey, Michigan, had regular steamship service. The passenger steamboats were also used as charters for day trips. Infamous among these are Lady Elgin, which sank in 1861 with 300 lives lost, Eastland, which capsized in the Chicago River in 1915 with the loss of 844 lives, and Noronic, which burned at the wharf in Toronto, Ontario in September of 1949 with the loss of 119 lives. While the boat had been known as the Queen of the Great Lakes, it is now also a symbol of the end of passenger cruises on the Great Lakes. SS North American and SS South American would continue service until 1967, when South American made a final run delivering passengers to the 1967 World's Fair in Montreal, Quebec. At that time, it was over. In 1915, the anti-monopoly provisions of Section 11 of the Panama Canal Act of 1912, which prohibited railroads under most circumstances from owning steamships, went into effect. As a result, railroad-owned company fleets were sold to buyers with no ownership interest in railways because under the new law, railroads had to divest themselves of their maritime divisions on the lakes. Under this divestiture law, Milwaukee Clipper, for example, was sold by the Anchor Line along with 4 other railroad-owned company fleets to the newly formed Great Lakes Transit Corporation. Under this flag, Milwaukee Clipper carried passengers along her old route until she was retired in 1971. Passenger boats on the Great Lakes were incredibly popular, and we love covering the Great Lakes. If you are enjoying this episode and want to hear more about ships, their careers, and their wrecks, check out our main show Shipwreck Sunday every Sunday night at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Okay, let's look at resort traffic and current services. Before trains and later cars became more prevalent, summer vacation areas and more remote areas around the Great Lakes were accessible primarily by steamboat. Northern Michigan's tourist and resort areas began to grow in this manner in the late 1890s. In the late 19th century, many early tourists arrived at Northern Michigan resort areas via a Lake Michigan steamboat. Chicago to Harbor Springs, Michigan was a popular trip for many passengers. Manitou would make the trip in 24 hours. In 1898, the fare was $5, not including meals or a stateroom. In 2025, that would be about $190. 2 other popular ships were Petoskey and Charlevoix, and their time to Harbor Springs was about 40 hours. The cost to take these boats in 1898 was $7, with meals and stateroom included. In 2025, that would be about $266. Early steamboats stopped at Harbor Springs due to its naturally very deep and protected harbor. Later, they added a stop in Petoskey. During the period between 1910 and 1931, crowds would gather at the Glen Haven docks on Saturdays and Sundays. Motor coaches awaited newly arriving resort guests, while many summer home residents rode to the docks to meet husbands or fathers arriving from the Chicago area. A tourist publication explained that, quote, "They leave Chicago Friday night and get here the next morning, first stop. They're with their families until Sunday night when the boat takes them back again, ready for the job. Great for 'em." Famous author Ernest Hemingway spent the majority of his first 22 summers in northern Michigan around Petoskey. He often traveled by steamboat from Chicago to Harbor Springs, a voyage that took 32 hours. Hemingway is known for his economical, understated style that later influenced 20th century writers, and he's been romanticized for his adventurous lifestyle and outspoken, blunt public image. Major lines on the Great Lakes included the Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company in the U.S., and in Canada, the Northern Navigation Company, which was later absorbed by Canada's steamship lines. Some were affiliated with railway companies such as the Ann Arbor Railroad, the Grand Trunk Railway, and the Pere Marquette Railway, which was absorbed into the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway in 1947. On Georgian Bay and Lake Huron, the ships of the Owen Sound Transportation Company Limited have shuttled passengers since 1921. As for current services, leisure cruises have given way to ferry services on the Great Lakes since the 1950s, transporting people and vehicles to and from various islands. Cruise traffic on the Great Lakes increased in the early 21st century, with boats like MS Hamburg, MS St. Laurent, and the smaller ships of the Great Lakes Cruise Company offering multi-day trips. The Great Lakes freighter headed out into Lake Superior like it was any other evening, with the weather conditions clear and calm. For the first few hours, all seemed normal, and the captain even went to bed, leaving the ship to his first mate. The ship suddenly came upon enormous rocks and crashed into them, and her fate became uncertain. In this week's episode of Shipwreck Sunday, we'll explore the fate of SS Emperor.